Chapter 12. Mr. Ono packed the car with borrowed camping gear. He had a week of vacation, and he planned to spend a few days in the forest with Lincoln and Mitsu. They would bike up a path where Buddhist worshippers went to pray at shrines and pay homage to dead ancestors. Mrs. Ono would stay home, enjoying a vacation from the three of them and their incessant need for food. Lincoln was free to go because he had returned the poems to Oyama-sensei, marked up with changes. He had been glad to get them out of the way. His own writing was terrible, and the thought of helping someone write poems scared him to death. As parting advice, Oyama-sensei had told him to practice Kempo while he was away because soon after he returned, he would have to take his second Kaiyu test. "It is good to get away," Mr. Ono said as he stuffed the backpacks and featherlight tent into the trunk of the car. "Tall trees, silence, peace." Lincoln enjoyed camping. Once he had spent 4 days in Yosemite, hiking in the snow with two uncles. He had thought he would freeze stiff as a root beer popsicle, but actually, he had been hot most of the time because hiking in the snow was tiring. His mother frowned at the idea of camping. She liked to sleep in a bed, not on the ground. She was scared that a raccoon might bite her while she slept, or that a spider might climb into her ear and hatch eggs that would make their way into the gray fold of her brain. Mr. Ono and the boys drove for 3 hours until they came to a mountain. Then the car began to climb and the air thinned. So that's factual information. As you go higher up in altitude, the air becomes thinner, so it actually is harder to breathe. So you have to make sure that you are adjusting to the change in altitude. When they rolled down the windows, the air rushed into their lungs, so Lincoln and Mitsu had difficulty breathing. When they took a corner, their chewing gum flew from their mouths. At this, they laughed so hard that Mr. Ono growled and told them to shut up because they were disturbing nature. When they arrived at the foot of the trail, Mitsu and Lincoln were nearly carsick. The last 6 miles had been twists and turns, and at 5,000 feet, the towns had given way to acres of trees. "I got a frog in my stomach," Lincoln groaned. "A frog?" Mitsu asked. "I feel like I'm going to throw up my breakfast." "I suggest that you don't," Mr. Ono said, heaving the backpacks onto the ground. "From now on, we eat once a day. Only nigirmeshi." "Only rice balls?" Lincoln asked, leaning against the car. "Rice and tea. We're here on a pilgrimage." So a pilgrimage is basically usually for a religious purpose where you go either on your own or with a small group and you go kind of to find your purpose or you're going in search of something. So they call it a pilgrimage. The path started out wide as a city street, but soon narrowed into a trail of pine trees, pine needles, and dank earth. So dank earth, kind of like a wet earth. They walked single file, silent. Lincoln's nausea had left him, and now he was just hungry. He thought, rice and tea, rice and tea. The pine needles crunched under the soles of his shoes. With each crunch, he pictured a bowl of shredded wheat, his least favorite cereal. But right now, it didn't sound so bad. After an hour, they rested on a fallen tree that was green with moss. A shred of blue sky showed between the tall pines, and in the distance, they could hear a river rushing over rocks. "Ah, this feels good," Mr. Ono said as he peeled off his gloves. Mitsu whispered to Lincoln, "Are you hungry?" Lincoln licked his lips and pressed the heel of his palm into his cavernous stomach. "I could eat a horse." "A horse?" Mitsu asked. "Do Americans eat horses?" "It's an expression, Mitsu. but I could eat a small pig between slices of bread, aka ham or bacon, some type of pork item. The boys laughed at the image of a whole pig laid out between huge slices of bread. On a pilgrimage, we go hungry, Mr. Ono said. So my question of the text there is why? What is the purpose of going hungry? So I don't have an answer, but that's something I would like to find out. In a little while, you will see a shrine and maybe a priest praying, maybe other people like us. They were 4 miles into the forest and hadn't seen any other hikers. Where is everyone? Lincoln asked. It's the wrong season, Mitsu said. Most come in October, not July. We are lucky that few people are around. Usually it's crowded. I wouldn't mind seeing some people. What if something happens to us? Yeah, we could starve. I don't know why my father is not letting us eat. After a few swallows of water from their canteens, they started again. Lincoln's backpack felt as heavy as his cousins used to when he would give them piggyback rides around the front yard. Although the late afternoon air was chilly, he was sweating. They soon came upon a shrine where a stone statue wore a woven hat and sat under a wooden shelter. A stalk of incense sent up a feathery, sweet-smelling smoke that the wind broke apart. This is the Jizo. He watches over children. Mr. Ono said to Lincoln, he protects you and you too, Mitsu. Hands pressed together in prayer, he bowed toward the shrine. Mitsu and Lincoln bowed with their eyes closed. There's a Catholic saint who protects children, but I forgot his name. You should have paid more attention in catechism, he scolded himself. So catechism is just another way of saying, I guess you could maybe relate it to like CCD classes if you are Catholic, or any type of classes like Sunday school classes where they teach you about religious beliefs and different people. And what if I need to call on this saint? How would I ask? Please, saint, oh, what's your name? Help me. Jizo means womb, Mr. Ono said, touching the statue's belly. He gives you comfort. We will see him many times on our trip. They took a few swallows of water and continued their trek. It was nearly dark. They walked 3 more miles and then pitched a tent among the ferns. Feels good, Mitsu said, unlacing his boots. Lincoln cracked the knuckles of his toes. I'm hurting. Could you eat a horse? Mitsu asked. If I had enough mustard, I could eat it alive. But there were no horses to eat for dinner. They each ate 2 rice balls, washing them down with cold tea. And after this, Mr. Ono whittled a stick, and Lincoln and Mitsu talked a while, mostly about baseball and girls, arguing whether girls were more beautiful with long or short hair. Then they climbed into their sleeping bags. Lincoln felt sticky, but good. So like when it's really humid and like wet, you just can't really get like fully dry. His stomach growled, but he didn't care. This was the 5th time he had gone camping, and the first in a foreign country. Now, if only he could dream in Japanese. Lincoln woke in the morning stiff as a twig. He was hurting from the long walk and the hard earth that had looked so soft when they pitched the tent. He stretched and let out a sleepy yawn. One of his socks had worked its way off his foot, so he plunged a groping hand into the end of the sleeping bag and fetched it. He then nudged Mitsu and said, "Get up, man." Mitsu let out a small moan but didn't stir. Lincoln pulled back the flap of the tent and crawled out. Mr. Ono, unshaven, was rubbing his hands over a small fire. He said, "Ohio! Good morning, Lincoln-kun." "Ohio," Lincoln said as he pulled himself to his feet. He did a few squats to get the blood going, and then he joined Mr. Ono for tea. "Smell the trees," Mr. Ono said. He stretched, sucked in some fresh air and let it out in a long sigh. My arm has some pain. Right here. He touched his shoulder. Lincoln splashed water from a metal pot onto his sleepy face. Maybe you slept wrong, he said, shuddering from the cold. I slept on my shoe. He rubbed his back where the shoe had poked him all night. No, this is different, Mr. Ono said as he peeled off his jacket and shirt and probed his arm. When he saw 2 red, swollen points, he looked serious. So this is it, he said calmly. They look like spider bites. He pinched the bites under until a clear pus ran like tears. It's ugly, Lincoln said, now fully awake. He had awakened hungry, but now his hunger collapsed to nothing. Does it hurt? No. What spider can hurt an old man like me? Mitsu surfaced from the tent and asked, What's going on? A spider bit your dad, Lincoln said. It is nothing, Mr. Ono said. He handed cups of steaming tea to the boys and shrugged back into his shirt. Let me see, Mitsu asked. It's nothing. I get hurt at work all the time. Now hurry up and let us go get ready. He buttoned his shirt and slipped his jacket back on. So, pause here for a minute. Do you think it really is nothing? Thinking about what you know about spider bites or spiders, do you think it's really nothing? Kind of make a prediction. Lincoln had been bitten countless times. Once by a parrot, twice by a dog, 6 times by a cat, and every summer for 14 years by a zillion blood-sucking mosquitoes. And once he had been bitten by a baby cousin. Luckily, the baby was toothless. It only took a tickle under the chin for her to relax her jaws. To get his blood going, Lincoln practiced prearranged Kempo forms. Mitsu followed along, laughing because he couldn't do them right. You're not helping, Lincoln scolded. Be serious. I'm going to be in a test in 2 weeks. After their breakfast of rice balls and tea, they broke camp and continued on their journey. They walked in a line between the shadows of the tall trees with Lincoln last. The ferns unfolded like large green waves and moss gripped the speckled rocks. Salamanders squirmed in the loose peat. So peat is the type of ground covering, like a mossy ground covering. And hordes, so big mounts of dragonflies hovered in the air. Mitsu turned and asked, Are your forests like this in America? I've only been to Yosemite. It's pretty nice, except for all the campers, Lincoln said. Doesn't anyone ever visit this forest? Mr. Ono responded, if they want to pray. Lincoln thought about this. He liked camping, but walking for 5 hours wearing a backpack to pray was not what he had expected. As they rounded a corner, an owl-like bird blinked at Lincoln, then snapped at a dragonfly and caught it. Did you see that bird? Lincoln asked. He's looking at us. Mitsu turned and gazed at the bird. No, he's looking at you. And so it seemed to Lincoln. His grandmother always said that birds were a warning. And Lincoln wondered about this bird's message. The bird stared at Lincoln, unblinking. So that is very true. If you look into different cultures, different religious ideas, birds, blackbirds specifically, usually if you see a blackbird, that is a representation of death or death is coming. And then there's different birds where something bad is about to happen. So it's kind of like a foreshadow for it. I'm not saying like that's 100%, but that is something that is thought of. And the fact that it's looking at Lincoln, it's like, well, what's going to happen to Lincoln? Right? Lincoln thought of the spider bites. He squeezed his arm hard, but he didn't feel any pain. Still, he wondered whether he had also been bitten and if a stream of poison were flooding his veins and arteries. Are you okay? Mitsu asked. Yeah, I'm wondering if I got bit too. You would know, Mitsu said. In our country, spider bites are serious. They can kill you. He looked at his father and whispered, "He looks sick, doesn't he?" Lincoln searched Mr. Ono's face. It was shiny with sweat, but was it sweat from the walk or from poison working in his system? "We'll watch him," Lincoln whispered. In the quiet of the forest, Lincoln had plenty of time to think of home. He wondered whether it was day or night there. Was his mother at home watching television with Roy? He wondered what Flacco was doing. Was he in another fight? Was he in trouble for running through the flower bed? Was he missing the late-night handouts Lincoln would give him from the refrigerator? As much as Lincoln had enjoyed his first 4 weeks in Japan, he was becoming homesick. So we know that they're there for a total of 6 weeks, and now we just have been given a time stamp where they've been there now for 4 weeks, so a whole month. So that's helpful for us to know as the reader. Just before noon, they reached another shrine. A monk was raking leaves with a straw broom. He greeted them in Japanese, and the three of them bowed. Incense made the place smoky and mysterious. "Cold day," Mr. Ono said after offering a short prayer at the shrine. "Yes, cold," the monk said. His teeth were black, and his hair was cropped so close to his scalp that it appeared blue. He wore a white robe and sandals, and prayer beads hung from his wrist. "This young man is from America," Mr. Ono said, gesturing to Lincoln, who was peeling off his backpack. "Ah, America. He is studying Kempo while he's here." "Ah, Kempo," the monk said, smiling. In Japanese, the monk told them he studied with Doshindo, the founder of Shorinji Kempo. Mitsu translated for Lincoln. "You studied with the founder?" So like the first person, the original person to create this type of martial art. Lincoln asked in English. He was impressed. The monk smiled and blushed faintly. Mitsu asked, "Will you please look at my father's arm? He's been bitten." "Bitten by an animal?" the monk asked. "No, a spider," Mitsu said. "It's nothing," Mr. Ono argued. The monk, putting aside his broom, asked Mr. Ono to take off his shirt. Mr. Ono reluctantly agreed, peeling off his backpack. The monk took the arm into his thin hands and studied the wounds. He pressed the wounds until a squeak of pain escaped Mr. Ono. The bites had now grown purplish and hard as tacks. Mitsu hovered over the arm, and Lincoln stood back watching the three of them. He knew now that Mr. Ono was seriously hurt. The monk muttered and scolded Mr. Ono. He said that he should return immediately and seek a doctor. Mr. Ono protested, trying to laugh it off. The priest scolded him again and then turned to Mitsu, warning him that if his father was not cared for, he could die. "Did you hear?" Mitsu said to his father. "We must go back." He was worried, and so was Lincoln. "Mitsu, we should go back," Lincoln agreed. "Right away." "You're right," Mr. Ono said after a moment. "We should return. I'm sorry to ruin our camping trip." "Forget the camping," Lincoln said. He suddenly felt itchy, as if a spider had nestled under his shirt, puncturing his back with tiny holes. "We better hurry." They thanked the monk, who bowed and muttered a prayer. He gave them a stick of incense, which was extinguished by a cold wind within a few steps. And when they were out of sight of the monk, they crushed it into the ground. They walked quickly, with the father between the two boys. The walk would take 6 hours, but luckily it was not yet noon, so they could make it back to the car before nightfall. "Look at me," the father said, chuckling to himself. "I'm being cared for by children." "We're not children," Mitsu said. "Quit joking." The father offered each of the boys a stick of gum and, mimicking Lincoln, said, "Be cool, essay." They talked about baseball for a while and then grew silent as they descended the path. They rested twice. By the third rest period, Mr. Ono was covered with sweat. He wanted to take off his jacket, but Mitsu forced him to keep warm. Mr. Ono shed his backpack, leaving it propped against a rock. Although the boys were hungry, they had to leave the food. 19 balls of rice and waxed paper. They walked for 3 hours. Mr. Ono was now feverish, and his armpit was swollen as large as a softball. So under your underarms, you have lymph nodes, which lymph nodes is what helps to clean out your system if you have any type of toxin or you're sick or anything. So that's why if you ever get sick, you find like you have pain here in your throat because you have lymph nodes here. You have lymph nodes under your underarm, and you also have some in your stomach area. And so that's the body's way of trying to work some stuff out. But that's very concerning that they're as big as like a softball. That's a big deal. He was tired and his breathing was shallow. So not only does he have the swelling of his lymph nodes, he's sweating profusely. He's trying to take off his jacket, but he needs to stay warm because obviously it must be cooler. And he now is having difficulty breathing. So now it's affecting his lungs and his heart. So that's all big red flags problem. Cut it, the father said when they stopped to rest at a small stream. He stripped off his jacket and shirt. Open it up. Lincoln and Mitsu looked at each other. They heard a bird cry in the distance and looked up at the trees. A warning? Lincoln wondered for a moment. You mean cut it open? Lincoln asked. Yes. I can't do that. I can't do it either, Mitsu said, looking away. The bird they had heard swooped away with a lizard in its beak. Lincoln hated the sight of blood. Once he had smashed his thumb in the car door and sprayed blood like a fountain pen. And then there had been nosebleeds and playground fights. How many t-shirts had he ruined trying to be brave? Cut it, the father scolded, handing Mitsu a small knife with a white ivory handle. Lincoln took the knife and said, I'll do it. He remembered watching cowboy movies, okay, this is when movies come in helpful to life, and how one of the snake-bitten cowboys would run a flame over the knife, which was to sanitize it, which that will work in a pinch. And Lincoln did the same with 3 matches bunched together. The blue flame licked the nickel-colored blade until it was black with soot. He wiped the soot off with a tissue. Lincoln probed the first bite. He tightened his stomach and jaw at the tip of the blade as the tip of the blade slowly disappeared under the swollen skin. Yellowish blood began to run from the wound. So, guys, pus. Okay, this is an infection right here. And a small grunt issued from Mr. Ono's mouth. So it's under so much pressure. He's just in so much pain, but he's, trying to be manly about it. Mr. Ono was gripping a handful of earth and his brow was tight from pain. New experience, Mr. Ono said between clenched teeth. Don't joke, Mitsu scolded. Lincoln turned away. His glance fell on the bird, which was now blinking at him. Beat it, Lincoln scolded. The bird flapped its wings and flew away. Mitsu took the knife from him and, almost crying, probed the second spider bite. His father watched him as liquid flooded from the wound. Mitsu squeezed the wound and more infected blood gushed out. Good son, Mr. Ono said as he started to rise slowly to his feet. Lincoln-kun, you are a brave boy. Lincoln, sick with worry, sat on a rock. He didn't feel brave. He felt like he had the time he was jumped by 3 dudes after a school dance. Scared. We should go, Mitsu said. Lincoln jumped up when he saw a long-legged spider at his feet. He stomped on the spider and yelled, Man, they're ugly! They wrapped the wounds and started off in a hurry. By the time they reached the car 2 hours later, it was dusk, so the sun had just started setting. Mr. Ono's fever had returned, and the boys, now stripped of backpacks, had to drag him between them on their shoulders, so now he can barely walk. They were sweaty and tired, and hunger growled in their stomachs. They unlocked the car door, and Mitsu looked at Lincoln and asked, "Do you know how to drive?" "Me? Drive? I'm 14, Lincoln said. He looked at the feverish Mr. Ono. "Yeah, I guess I can figure it out." They put him in the back seat and wrapped him in a blanket. Lincoln started the car and, muttering, "There goes," pressed the gas pedal. The car lurched and slowly advanced from the side of the road onto the empty highway. Mitsu found an apple on the seat. He took a bite, and then Lincoln took a bite. "Man, I'm hungry," Lincoln said, his mouth rolling with apple pulp. "Careful," Mitsu warned. Lincoln swerved the car, nearly running into a fence. He looked down at the speedometer. He was going 35. That's not too fast, he thought. And he remembered going 25 on his skateboard and nearly 40 on a 10-speed bike. But he remembered he had crashed both times and skinned up his elbows and knees. "We must get to that farm town," Mitsu said, his voice urgent. "There will be a doctor there." So just because they opened the wound, opened the spider bites and drained out the pus that was there, the infection is now still running through his bloodstream. So this is still not a good situation. The car bounced when it hit a pothole, and the three of them nearly crashed their heads through the roof. Mr. Ono muttered something, and Mitsu lowered his ear to his father. "Quit joking," Mitsu exploded. "It's not funny." "What did your dad say?" Lincoln asked. "He says he wants to hear rock music." "That's what he's going to get," Lincoln said as he flipped on the radio. He worked the steering wheel like the horns of a bull. It was 10 miles to that town, and already dark in the unlit mountains where at night spiders took over.